So if you caught my last video, you know that I found a few things on this website that I wanted us to tackle and explore trying to build out, and this is kind of the second part of this video. Now you're going to recognize something if you watch that past video that we're going to have to recreate again in this video, and it's here when we hover over these cards, we see that little sweeping effect that comes across the cards. Now I did that in a lot of detail in the previous video, so if you missed that, go ahead and look down in the video description below and you can find a link to that video. I'm going to recreate it again here, but I probably won't go as slow through it or explain every step in it. However, this takes it to a new level. One, we're using some CSS Grid here to control this layout where we have 2 columns and 2 rows. This image on the left, of course, is taking up 2 of those rows, which is something we can explore doing. But beyond that, when we hover over these cards, you can see the text inside the cards actually change color. And we have 2 cards that are essentially the same, but styled slightly different. So we're going to have to create a variation of each one of these cards. This section may seem pretty simple, but there's a few things in here where you got to use a few tips and tricks to really make it all come out right. If that sounds interesting to you, then stick around and let's get started. So back here inside the editor, let's go ahead and just get all of these elements on the page. We'll start with a section and an inner container. I'm going to go back into this section and we're going to add a little bit of padding. I already have some utility classes set up from my child theme, so that will take care of some of that padding for us. Now, I do have my browser zoomed in quite a bit just to make it a little bit easier to see everything here on the screen share, but that might squish some of the elements inside this video. So we're not going to go for a pixel perfect recreation, but we're going to try to recreate the general idea of what they have on that page. So here inside of our container, we really need 3 containers inside of it. So I'm just going to go ahead and add the first and then use my keyboard shortcuts to duplicate that so I end up with 3 containers inside of it. We'll go ahead and go back to our wrapper, and here's where we can add our first class to set up the CSS grid. I'm just going to call this Talon Grid, and we'll go ahead and hit create. Now inside of this, I want to set up the CSS grid layout. So I'm going to go in here under layout, display, and we're going to change this to grid. Now here we can go inside of our grid layout and we can set up our rows and columns. Now I'm going to go ahead and use the helper here for my columns, which is just this repeat 2 min max 0 1 fr. This is a little bit longer way to write it, but it does help us out with some of the responsive settings. And you'll see as soon as I did that, it's moved these boxes around. So now that we have 2 columns. Under the grid template rows, I'm just going to do a repeat 2, 1 fr, which will just make sure we have 2 rows. Now, a lot of times when you're setting up CSS Grid, you don't explicitly have to set the rows. You're just going to let those kind of grow as you fill in content. But here, I want to make sure that we're setting 2 rows so I can position all these cards inside of it appropriately. Now that we got the general idea of what this looks like, we can go ahead and start working on some of the cards inside of it. Now inside this first card is where we're going to have our image. So I'm just going to go ahead and add an image block here and then grab that from my media library. We'll select that image and that will put it inside this card. Now I want to go back to the container that's wrapped around this card here. And this is where I want to tell it to stretch 2 rows. So we'll go ahead and give this a class. I'm going to call it Talon Card, and we're going to use this class on all of the cards in here, on any of the styles that they share, and then we can override some of these with some unique styles for each one of the cards as they have a little bit of variation. So we'll go ahead and hit create here. We'll start with the blank style, and we can add that same class to each one of these cards. So I'm going to go ahead and add that to the second one and the third one as well. Now, one thing I know we can add to each one of these is the border radius. This has a pretty big radius on it. So I'm going to go ahead and add a 24 pixel border radius to it. And while we're here under the position tab, I'm going to change the overflow to clip on both the X and Y axis. And this will just make sure that any of the elements inside of these cards get clipped off at that same border radius. Now, because we know each one of these cards have a little bit something different, let's go ahead and add some modifier classes to this. So this first one here, which has the image in it, we'll call it Talon Card again, but I'm going to do a double dash, and here we're going to say featured. Go ahead and add that class. We'll go to our second card here. This is the card that's going to be at the top section. We'll call this one Talon Card double dash dark, since it has the dark background. And then we'll go to our last one here and do Talon Card double dash light. Go ahead and hit create. And we're good to go on all of those. Now for this first card where we have the featured, I want to go ahead and select that class, go into our layout, and under our grid row, I want to change this to 1/3. That's just going to make sure that it spans both of our rows here. And now you can see that second card is coming in over on the side here, which is perfect. Now we got that general layout where we have one big card on the left and then two over here on the right-hand side. If you're confused as to why I would use 1/3 in this scenario, you have to understand how the grid columns and rows are counted. You'll see in this section here, we have 4 boxes going across and 3 going down. But as far as our grid columns, we have 1, which starts over here on the left side of the box, then 2, which is the end of the first box, and also the beginning of the second box. Then of course, 3, 4, and 5 over here on the right-hand side. The same works with our rows, which are labeled in blue here. We have 1 just above our first row, 2 in between our first and second rows, and so on. So in the layout we're trying to accomplish here, if we put our grid lines on, we see we have 1 where we want this box to start, and we want it to span all the way down to 3 where it's going to end here after the third row. We have 1, 2, 3 rows, which creates 2 areas for content to fit in. Obviously, we do need to add some padding into this, so I'm going to go back into our grid class here for the Talon grid. We'll go into our gap settings and we'll change this to something maybe like 24 pixels just to give these a little bit of space in between each one of them. Now, before we get too far, I want to go ahead and add the content inside of these. So I'll go ahead and set up one here, and then we can fast forward the video as I set up the other. So this first one has a headline that says seasonal location. Underneath it, it has some text. I actually can't copy and paste it very easily, so I'm just going to put in some placeholder text there. And then we have a link that says more information on these locations. I'll go ahead and highlight that. I'm going to make this a GenerateBlocks text block just so I have a little bit more control over it. And we'll just go ahead and give it a blank link for now. While I'm at it, I'll go ahead and change this to a generate text block as well. We can grab all 3 of these, copy it, go down into our second card here. We'll go ahead and paste that in, and then I can just quickly swap out the text. Now, we run into a few areas with this layout where you could do it several different ways here. We know these cards on the right have a background color and quite a bit of padding in them. If I just went in here to the Talon card class, I could go in here and add some padding. We'll say maybe like 48 pixels of padding. We can see that takes care of these cards on the right. They look nice, but now our featured card over here also has the padding, which really isn't something we want. Now in this case, 2 cards need the padding and 1 doesn't. Each one of these have a modifier class on them, so I think I'll just use the modifier class on this featured one to get rid of that padding. So I'll go back in here to the Talon card featured. We'll go into our spacing and we'll link all these together and change that padding to 0, which should just make sure that that image is able to fill up all that space without any padding, and that won't affect our 2 cards over here on the right, which both need the padding inside of them. Now, while we're looking at this image, we can see the top of it is lined up nicely. We have the border radius, but at the bottom, this image isn't actually stretching to the bottom of the container, so we need to take care of that. Now, you might be wondering why I didn't just use a background image inside of this column cell. That would make this a whole lot easier, and by default, the image would stretch the entire width and height. I actually did a video on this here recently that explains the reasons why you'd probably want to use an image in this scenario rather than a background image. If you're not exactly sure why, then I would recommend watching that video after you finish this one. So let's go ahead and add a class. We'll call this Talon Grid _featured-image. Go ahead and hit create. We'll start this from blank, and we'll go into the sizing and we'll make sure the width and height is both set to 100%. And if we get rid of the block settings that are on there by default, that will just make sure that this image stretches both the entire width and height of this area. Now we can see we get our nice border radius at the bottom of it taken care of. I think that's all we're really going to need to do to this, so we can turn our attention over here to these columns on the right. Going back to the example here, I think our best bet is to look at which common characteristics each one of these cards have. Now, we already took care of the border radius on these cards. We can see they have different background colors, they have different text colors and link colors. I think the only thing they share here is the headline color, so we can see the seasonal location and the space for rent both have that same bright green color, so we can go ahead and add that to our class as well. We'll just go ahead and grab one of these containers. I'm going to go to the Talon card here, and we're going to do another class on top of this, which we can get to in our manage selectors. Basically, what I want to do is be able to select all the headings inside of these cards. Now we know in this case we have an H2, but I want to set this up where it would work if it's an H3 or an H4 if I'm using it somewhere on the site and the headlines need to be a different order. So we'll go ahead and go into our selector here, And we're going to type in :is and open and close our parentheses. Now inside of that, I'm just going to go ahead and do H2, H3, H4, H5, and that will probably take care of any circumstance on here where we have a different heading level in it. We'll go ahead and hit create, and now we're controlling any heading that's inside of one of these cards. So I need to go into the typography, into the text color, and I'll go ahead and paste in this color here, which we can see takes effect right away on both cards since they share this class. We'll jump back out into our main selector, and one thing I notice is these aren't perfectly centered inside their container. Both of these need to be centered both horizontally and vertically, so we can take care of that on the Talon card class. To do that, I think I'll set the display of these cards to flex. We'll make sure to set that flex direction to column so they stack back up on top of each other. And then we can go into our alignment and just make sure it's aligned to the left. And the justify content is aligned to center just to make sure it gets centered vertically inside those cards. Without the background, it's kind of hard to see, but that's something I know we're going to need to take care of just to make sure that these are spaced out properly. We can deal with this top card first, which is our dark variation. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that card and we'll go into our Talon card dark class. Now we know we need to set the background color. So I'll go ahead and open that up and paste in the hex value for that. And we can see our text doesn't look great on this and neither does our link. So inside these managed selectors, let's go ahead and grab our links since we have that option right here. And we'll set the text color on the link to white, which I already have inside my palette, which is great. But we also need to set that text color. To set our text color, we can just go back to this Talon card dark class, and we can set our text color from here just to set that to the white color so it shows up nice on that dark background. Now that we got that set up, we'll turn our attention to the bottom card here, which is our light variation. We're going to do something similar here where we go into that Talon card light class. We'll go into our backgrounds and change this background color to white, and that just barely stands off the background here. I don't think I got the exact background color for this section, but hopefully you can see that coming through on the screen share. Now on this light version, the links are actually the same bright green that we had for the headings here. So let's go into our manage selector. We'll go back to our links, into the text color, and then we can paste in that brighter green value here. Now throughout this tutorial, you're going to see me kind of randomly paste in some hex values for these different colors, and I really wouldn't recommend doing that. You really want to set these up inside your theme so you have the use of the color variables. I was just trying to hurry through some of this and pasting in some of the hex values from the inspiration site we found, but obviously you're not going to want to just paste in random hex values all over your website because it makes it a real beast to maintain. Now, the only thing I think we need to do at this point before we deal with any of the hover situations is take care of this underline on the links. Eventually, we're going to make this entire card clickable, which will give you the pointer on top of it. And on the example site, they didn't have these underlines on the links, so we're going to do the same thing here. Now, we can apply this to all the cards. So I'll go in here into the Talon card. We'll open up our additional selectors and I'll select links. And we can go down here under typography and we can make sure that we set the text decoration to none for these, which will just get rid of the underline on all of the links. Thankfully, all the responsive settings for this section are pretty simple. We'll go back in here into our Talon grid and we'll go down to our tablet view. Obviously, this looks pretty terrible here, but what they did on the site we're taking inspiration from is just put all of this into a single column, which is a pretty easy fix. Since we're already using grid, I'm just going to go into our grid layout here, and I'm going to change this grid template columns to 1FR, which will just make sure each one of these cards takes up one column's width. Now our image is pretty tall here. It's still trying to span 2 rows. So I'm going to go in here into our Talon card featured. We'll go into the sizing and I'm going to change that aspect ratio to 1/1. This is just going to help make this more of a square image. You can see here when I click off of it, now we just have a big nice square. It's still featured and bigger than the other cards, but it's not taking up a gigantic amount of space here. Of course, we can test this on our mobile version as well, and I think this is going to work fine. Now, maybe there's a little bit too much padding inside these cards, so we can go back into the Talon card where we set up that padding. We'll go down into our spacing and maybe we change this to 24 pixels on mobile here just to make it a little bit tighter. You can see the editor's struggling a little bit with how we've laid things out, but if we click off of these things, they look quite a bit better this way. And I think that amount of padding is a bit better for our mobile version. At this point, we get to start working on the fun part of this tutorial where we get to start tackling some of these hover effects. You can see on the example site here, when I hover over either one of these cards, they get the same minty green background color, and then the text inside them changes color as well. Both the text and the links down here turn to this dark green color, and we can apply this to both of these cards on the right-hand side. So back here inside the editor, we're going to tackle this the same way we did in the last video where I created this same effect. Now I'll go through this a little bit quicker this time, but if you didn't watch that video, you should be able to follow along here. We're going to go ahead and select our Talon card class. We'll go down to the very bottom here where we get to position, and I want to make sure to set this to relative. We're setting that here because we want to use a pseudo element to create that little effect, and we need it to be captured inside of each one of these cards. So to create our pseudo element, I'll go to our manage selectors, click new, and we can go ahead and select that before pseudo element and hit create. Now for pseudo elements, especially in this case, we need to just have blank content. So I'm just going to put in 2 quote marks here, which will take care of the content. We can go into our position and set the position to absolute. I'm going to go ahead and set the inset to be 0 at the top, 0 at the right, and 0 at the bottom. That's just going to make sure our pseudo element is positioned over here on the right-hand side. Now we can go into the sizing here. I'm going to go ahead and give this maybe 50 pixels of width just so we're able to see it on the screen. But the important part here is we want to set 100% height. Now we're still not seeing anything here, and that's because it doesn't have any color. So we'll go ahead and open that background color and paste that in, and we can see our pseudo element showing up over here on the right-hand side, which is exactly what we want. Of course, we don't want this showing at all when nothing's hovered, so I'm going to change that width back to 0, which will make it disappear here. We do, however, want to use a transition effect, so I'm going to go into our effects panel, add a transition. We'll change this to something maybe like 0.25 seconds, and we'll just leave everything else as is. Now to create that sweeping effect, what we need to do is change this before pseudo element anytime we hover on this card. So to do that, we need to create a new selector here. I'll go ahead and click on new. We're going to use a compound selector, or you can just type in the ampersand, and we're going to type in a colon is, open and close our parentheses, and inside of that, we're going to target both the focus and hover states. So we type in a colon focus, then a comma, and colon hover. Now we're wanting to target that before element, so I'll do my double colons and type in before, and go ahead and hit create. So now you can see the selector that we created up here is our Talon card. When it is hovered or focused, grab that before pseudo element. All we need to do is change that width to 100%. And now when we hover over this, you can see that effect is happening where that background color sweeps across the card. Now, one problem with the way we set up these classes and hover classes is that's actually going to happen here when we hover over this featured card as well. And we don't want the same effect on the featured card. Now, we could have probably set this up a little bit differently and maybe arranged our classes a little bit differently, but I think we can still take care of this with the way we set it up now. We'll select that featured card here, and we'll go into our Talon card _featured, which is just for this one over on the left-hand side. We'll go in here and create a new selector. And in this case, we want to select just the before element for this featured card when the card is hovered. I know that's a lot to digest here, but let's take a look at how it would work. We'll do our ampersand to do our compound selector, colon is, open our parentheses, hover, focus, and here we're going to target that before element. So now we're targeting that same before element, but we're only targeting it here on this featured card. So we can go ahead and hit create. We'll change that width to 0, which will just make sure that it still works on these 2 cards over on the side since they're not the featured cards. But when we hover over the featured one here, it no longer has that same effect. We're using this modifier class here just to give it a little bit of different behavior from the other ones. Like I said, there's a bunch of different ways you could tackle this, and maybe this wasn't the most straightforward. However, I think this is a pretty good example of where using modifier classes comes in handy. All of these cards shared some properties, so we could put all of those on a single class. Then we could use modifier classes to do the little individual tweaks that were just a bit different about each one of these. In this case, we ended up writing a pretty complex selector. However, we had to write less CSS that would be distributed across all these different cards individually, making it harder to tweak those global things in the long run. Next, let's go ahead and tackle the color of the text changing when we hover over either one of these boxes. So we'll get out of all of these styles here, and we'll go ahead and select our Talon card since we want this to be affected on all of our different cards here. Here we'll go ahead and select hover and focus, and we can go down to our typography settings and paste in that dark green value. Now when we hover over either one of these cards, you can see the body text here is changing over to that dark green color, which is perfect. Now we need to do the same thing to our headlines as well as our links, so we're gonna have to create selectors for those as well. For the links, you might be tempted to use the hovered links or hovered and focus links, but that's only going to change these links when you're actually hovering over the link itself, so we need to create our own selector here. So what we'll do is do our ampersand, :is, hover, focus, just like we did before, and then we'll do a space because we're going to target something inside of this selector, which is our A, or our link. We'll go ahead and create that selector. Again, we'll go down to our text color and paste in that hex value. And now when we hover over these cards, you can see the links are turning to that dark green color as well. Now we just need to repeat this same process for our headlines. So we'll go in here, new, ampersand, is, hover, focus. Inside of that, we're going to target is H2, H3, H4, H5, just to cover all our bases for the different types of headlines that could end up inside this card. We'll go ahead and hit create. Again, down in text color, we'll paste in that hex value, and now you can see those headlines are changing as we hover over these cards as well. At this point, I think it's a good idea for us to save our changes and go take a look and see if everything's working properly on the front end. So I'll just go ahead and save and publish this page, and now we can go ahead and view it. Now, as I hover over these cards, we can see we have a few issues, mostly having to do with the Z index of our pseudo element here. You can see it's actually covering up all of the content inside of it, and we want that pseudo element to be behind all of our text in here. There's a cool little trick you can do using isolation isolate to take care of this pretty easily, but we're not able to do that inside the editor. So let me show you how I'd tackle this if we were just using the controls inside the editor. We'll click on any of these cards just so we can select that Talon card class. I'm going to go in here and find our before pseudo element, and we'll scroll down into the position here, and I'm just going to set this Z index to 1. We'll go back into our main selector here. I'm going to go ahead and create one more selector, and here we're just going to use a star selector. We're not using the compound here because we want to select anything inside of these cards. I'll go ahead and hit create. We'll scroll down again to the position, and we'll change this Z index to 5 just to be safe. Let's save those changes and check that on the front end. And now you can see when we hover over these cards, that pseudo element is back behind our text, which is exactly what we wanted. I think we have just one more thing we need to take care of, and that's making sure that the link that we have down here at the bottom of each one of these cards is stretched around to this entire card. So anywhere we hover on top of this card, we can click and be able to navigate to the page it's taking us to. I think this is nice from a UX point of view here, because if you hover over this card and have this effect, you're going to imagine that it does something, and you're probably not going to go down and click on this link. Now, instead of just grabbing the card itself and making it a link, I want to make sure that this text is still the link, especially for screen readers who are going to be hearing these links read out. But if we use a stretch link technique, we can actually stretch the size of this link to take up the entire card, but still only have this text linked here. Just to make sure you understand the stretch link idea, I thought I'd break in here and show you a bit of a more visual example. We have a representation of our card here with our link down at the bottom. Now, traditionally with a link, the only thing that would be clickable is the area right around this text. So I've just thrown a red box on top of it so you can see what would be clickable inside of this scenario. However, with the stretch link, we take this clickable area and we expand it to the entire size of the card. This way, the entire card is clickable, so anywhere somebody puts their mouse on top of this card, they're able to click that link. The difference between this and just linking the card is that now we're still using this as the anchor text for our link, which is going to be a whole lot better for screen readers. If we were just to put the link on the card itself, we'd have to add some kind of ARIA label to explain what this link was for. But because we're using the link text here as the actual link, none of that extra work is required, and it's a lot better for accessibility purposes. Now, this is something I explained in a little bit more detail inside my starter site video, but let me show you how the CSS for this works, and then we can just apply it by adding a class to each one of these cards. Here inside my child link, I have all the CSS for this stretch link, so I can just use it as kind of a utility class inside the editor. I'll make sure to link to where you can get all the CSS if you don't want to type it out, but let me run you through how it works real quick. We're going to put the stretch link class on the container or the card itself, and it's going to set that to a position of relative. Now in our setup, we already set that to relative, so we don't necessarily need that. But since we're using this as a utility class, we want to make sure we're careful of all situations. Now the next line here is going to grab any link inside that stretch class and create a pseudo element that is blank and fills up the entire space by using a combination of position absolute and inset 0. Now here we just do a few things with the focus state just so it makes it apparent that you're focused on these elements. Basically, all this is going to do is take the link area from just the text itself that's linked and stretch it to the entire size of the card. So let's go ahead and make sure that's updated, and we'll jump back into our page. Because we have this set up as a utility class, all I have to do is go to the two cards that are going to be the links and just add that stretch link class. So we'll just type in stretch-link and hit create. We'll go down to our second card here at the bottom and we'll add that same class, stretch. Now that I've entered it inside the global styles here, it will remember it. And we'll go ahead and save these changes. And again, go ahead and view it on the front end. And now you can see when we hover over these cards, we get our pointer anywhere where we're inside the card, and that's going to link us to wherever the link inside the card is taking us to. This link inside the card is just being stretched to fit the entire width and height of these cards, which is a great way to do this for accessibility purposes and make it easy for people who are keyboard navigating through the site to know exactly what they're clicking on. And because we've already done all those responsive settings, everything looks nice as we go down to our tablet and mobile breakpoints. So I would call this layout good to go. Now what looked like a pretty simple section actually had a few intricacies in here, and hopefully you learned something along the way. We covered setting up CSS Grid, making it mobile responsive. We put in classes and modifier classes. We even used a few utility classes along the way. And of course we added that cool swipe in hover effect, which really is what makes this section stand out. Hopefully you learned a few things during this video. If you did, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. And if you want to make sure to catch the next one, hit subscribe and we'll see you then.